Good morning, everyone. And this is Sai Kripa from English Department, Assistant Professor of English, Vistas. So the title of the paper is The Romantic Age. So in this paper, we have totally 5 units, but today's session, it's going to focus only the unit 1. So unit 1, what's the title of that unit? That is Romanticism in England, Romantic Revival, the starting point of Romantic era, then lyrical ballads. So these are the topics we are going to see under the title, that is unit 1. Okay. So in beginning, we are going to see that the introduction part of that romanticism. What is romanticism? What defines romanticism? What are the characteristics of the romanticism? What are the functions of romanticism? So we are going to see in a different angles of romanticism. Okay. Actually, the Romantic period began roughly around 1798 and lasted until some 1837, which means 17th to 18th century. The political and economic atmosphere at the time heavily influenced this period, with many writers finding inspirations from the French Revolution. Okay, so French Revolution, so we will see later what defines the French Revolution. Okay, so there was a lot of social change during this period. So very first, you should know one thing, that is Romanticism when it started. Okay, what about the period? The period this means that is between a 17th to 18th century. Okay, what happened actually? Generally, what happened during that time? So there were a lot of social changes in all aspects. Okay. Then we will see what defines the romantic moment. Romanticism is a literary movement spanning roughly 1719 to 1850. The movement was characterized by celebration of nature and the common man. Celebration of nature and common man, a focus on individual experience and idealization of woman, and an embrace of isolation and melancholy. So romantic movement means that is characterized by celebration of nature and the common man. Okay, and also it should be focused only on individual experience, idealization of woman, and an embrace of isolation and melancholy. The Romantic movement, which originated in Germany but quickly spread to England, France, and beyond, reached America around the year 1820. Some 20 years after William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge had revolutionized English poetry by publishing lyrical ballads. So lyrical ballads is the term very important one. It was very famous during that period. In America, as an era of fresh new vision electrified artistic or intellectual circles. Yet, there was an important difference. Romanticism in America coincided with a period of national expansion and the discovery of a distinctive American voice. The solidification of a national identity and the surging idealism and passion of Romanticism nurtured the masterpiece of the American Renaissance. Romantic ideas centered around art as inspiration, the spiritual and aesthetic dimension of nature, and metaphors of organic growth, art rather than science, Romantics argued could best express universal truth. The Romantics underscored the importance of expressive art for the individual and society. In this Romanticism, the poet, which means that a particular year 1844, Ralph Waldo Emerson, perhaps the most influential writer of the Romantic era. So he quoted about the Romanticism, for all men live by truth and stand in need of expression in love, in art, in avarice, in politics, in labor, in games, to utter out painful secret. The man is only of himself, the other of is his expression. So the beautiful quote expressed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The development of the self became a major theme in Romanticism period. Self-awareness, a primary method. If, according to Romantic theory, self and nature were one, self-awareness was not a selfish, dead end, but a mode of knowledge opening up the universe. If one's self were one with all humanity, then the individual had a moral duty to reform social inequalities and relieve human suffering. The idea of self, which suggested selfishness to earlier generations, was redefined. Again, I will call out that the same phrase, the idea of self, which suggested selfishness to earlier generations, was redefined. New compound words with the positive meanings emerged: self-realization, self-expression, self-reliance. So these are the major themes were used by so many critics and writers. So this was the major theme. Which one? That is self. Self is the root word. By using that root word, the writers used in all aspects of this compound words. So what are the compound words? They are self-realization, self-expression, self-reliance. As a unique subjective, self became important. So did the realm of psychology. Exceptional artistic effects and techniques were developed to evoke heightened psychological states. The sublime, an effect of beauty in grandeur, for example, produced feelings of awe, reverence, vastness, and a power beyond human comprehension. Romanticism was affirmative and appropriate for most American poets and creative essayists. America's vast mountains, deserts, and tropics embodied the sublime. The Romantic spirit seemed particularly suited to American democracy. It stressed individualism, affirmed the value of the common person, and looked to the inspired imagination for its aesthetic and ethical values. Certainly, the New England transcendentalists Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and their associates were inspired to new optimist affirmation by the Romantic movement. In New England, Romanticism fell upon fertile soil. So, what about the Romantic movement belief? What actually the major part of that believeness among the people, among the writers, among the critics? Any list of particular characteristics of literature of Romanticism includes subjectivity and an emphasis of individualism, spontaneity, freedom from rules, solitary life rather than life in society. The beliefs that imagination is superior to reason and devotion to beauty, love of and worship of nature in Romantic movement. So Romantic movement dates its origin in 1798 AD with the publication of lyrical ballads. So lyrical ballads, that is a Magna Carta, big constitution of the Romantic movement. This movement in literature was preceded and accompanied by the change from the monarchy to democracy in politics, from materialism to idealism in philosophy, from conservation old style to radicalism in culture, and from orthodoxy to emancipation in religion. The influences that shaped the movement traveled as much from the foreign lands like France and Germany as they emerged from the native soil of England. In terms of borrowing from literary sources, Germany served the Romantic movement quite as much as France had served the neoclassical movement and Italy had served the Renaissance movement. While the Renaissance movement began in Italy, a neoclassical movement in France and the Romantic movement made its first appearance in Germany. So this is the very important part, the origination and the influence of Romanticism in countries. So again, I will call out that the phrases again. See, that is Romantic movement. Quite as much as France had served the neoclassical movement and Italy had served the Renaissance movement, while the Renaissance movement began in Italy, a neoclassical movement in France, and the Romantic movement made its first experience in Germany. Actually, Romanticism is the highly influential artistic and literary movement of the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe in revolt against the aristocratic, social, and political norms of the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific rationalization of nature. Romanticism had its origin in late 1700s in Europe, particularly in France, Germany, and England. It is difficult to trace the exact beginnings of Romanticism, but it was during the mid 18th century that there began a change in the way people saw tradition. There was a surge of interest in folklore, and the belief in the storytelling ability of the common, uneducated man was formed. The folk tradition focused on simplistic and natural aspects of life, with the stories being passed down to generations orally. Thus, the art and literature, especially poetry of the era, contained vivid descriptions of nature and were focused on the lives of common man rather than the aristocracy. This was also the period nationalistic movement in various parts of Europe, owing to the many civil wars and revolutions. People developed a sense of nationalization which was often reflected in their writings. The Romantic movement also caused the revisit of some aspects of the medieval age, such as the belief in the supernatural. The age in a sense it refers the Romantic period, was also significant due to the discovery of new lands and colonization. Hence, there also was an emphasis on exoticism in the art and literature of the age. Description of far-off lands was a common feature in the works of the period. There was also a revival of religious piety and faith, and there was also an increased emphasis on individualism. Okay, now you will see the characteristics of Romantic literature. Characteristics. First one, individualism. The writers of the Romantic era gave great importance middle of the paper, that is, upheavals. The writers of the Romantic era were also revolutionary and rebellious in nature. They believed in experimentation and refused to confine themselves within the bondage of rules. Romanticism in English poetry, especially we are having the period that is 1798 to 1832, the Romantic era with regards to English poetry is considered to have started in 1798 with the publication of lyrical ballads of Wordsworth and Coleridge. William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Lord Byron are the important Romantic poets. The characteristics of Romantic literature as described above are reflected in the works of these poets who were near contemporaries. Their contribution to English poetry gains particular importance in the light that they freed poetry from the constraints of aristocracy and enriched poetry by adding elements of music, nature, and imagination to it. It was partly a revolt against aristocratic, social, and political norms of the age of enlightenment and a reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature, and was embodied most strongly in the visual arts, music, and literature. It is one of the curiosities of literary history that the strongholds of the Romantic movement were England and Germany, not the countries of the Romantic language themselves. Thus, It is from the historians of English and German literature that we inherit the convenient set of terminal dates for the Romantic period, beginning in 1798, the year of the first edition of Lyrical Ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and of the composition of Hymns to the Night by novelists, and ending in 1832. One of the seminal article under the title of On the Discrimination of Romanticism, some scholars see Romanticism as completely continuous with the present. Some see it as the inaugural moment of the modernity. Some see it as the beginning of a tradition of resistance to the Enlightenment, and still others date it firmly to the direct aftermath of the French Revolution. Romanticism is often understood as a set of new cultural and aesthetic values. It might be taken to include the rise of individualism, as seen by the cult of the artistic genius that was the prominent feature in the Romanticism. Romanticism is often understood as a set of new cultural and aesthetic values. And also, it might be taken to include the rise of individualism as seen by the cult of the artistic genius that was a prominent feature in the romantic worship of Shakespeare and in the poetry of Wordsworth. To take only two examples, a new emphasis on common language and the depiction of apparently everyday experiences and experimentation with new non-classical artistic forms. Romantics had a heightened look into the inside of a person, looking into imagination as a means to transcend experience and spiritual truth. The first phase of Romanticism in English literature began in 1790 with lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Romantic literature in Germany began with the innovations in the content and style of literature and an obsession with the mystical and supernatural. So the first phase of the Romanticism started in 1790. So that part, that area and year you should mention. You should remember that. And second phase of Romantic thought in literature was marked by an emergence of cultural nationalism and attention to national origin. So the new appreciation of a history led to the creation of historical novels which are thought to be invented by Sir Walter Scott. Then, romantic virtuosity. What is romantic virtuosity? As the many social political revolutions of the late 18th century established new social orders and new ways of life and thought, composers of the time period broke new musical ground by adding a new emotional depth to the prevailing classical forms. Okay, so what is romantic virtuosity? Romantic virtuosity, as the many social particular revolutions of the late 18th century established new social orders and new ways of life and thought, composers of the time period broke new musical ground by adding a new emotional depth to the prevailing classical forms. This period is known as the Romantic period. It occurred approximately from 1820 to 1920. Then, artists became intent in expressing their subjective personal emotions. Romanticism derives its name from the romances of medieval times, long poems telling stories of heroes and chivalry, of distant lands and faraway places, and often of unattainable love. It deals with the nature of emotions, especially in his 1798 lyrical ballads, whom he co-authored with Samuel Coleridge. William Wordsworth described poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So what's that? Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. Both Wordsworth and Coleridge were pioneers of the Romantic movement, which stressed the importance of expressing emotions, particularly through poetry. Nature was a key element for the Romantic movement. Romanticism encouraged exploration of feelings, and many poets used nature as an inspiration for their thoughts. Another important aspect was the idea of intuition over reason. Then we can see the Byron's poetries, how he used the characteristics of Romanticism. Okay, so Byron's poetry awoke in him the insatiable desire to create, summing up the general mood in which the Romantics felt free to trust their own creativity and talents after the age of revolution. The two key topics to consider when defining Romanticism are both its themes and its dates. Romantic elements include themes that link to nature and the natural, exploring human psychology through the study of the individual and natural order of the world. The visual images that manifested from these subjects included an equally powerful depiction of nature versus man, the forgotten suffering of historical events. Indeed, most subjects that had a strong impression and emotional influence on the artist's imagination. Romanticism is realism's influence on literature and American music. The age of realism brought together intellectuals such as the father of modern short stories, Henrik Ibsen, and famous musicians such as Scott Joplin. This exact movement communicated an abandonment from the influences of both the intellectual and romantic movements that came before it in America. Some of the most recognized works of American music and literature were produced outside of the period of realism. The changes in society and the social well being of the people underlie the primary purpose of the Romantic movement. Then, Romanticism originally was the reaction against the Enlightenment. That is originating in Europe in the late 18th century, that we all know that we all came to know, that is it's happened in Europe. Romanticism era characterized an interest in nature and emphasized the individual's emotions and imagination. The sudden change in attitudes formed an age of classism and rebellion against established social rules and conventions, praising imagination over reason, emotions over logic, and intuition over science. Okay, so how beginningly it's a deal with praising imagination over reason, emotions over logic, and intuition over science. This made way for a vast body of literature of great sensibility and passion. The variety of this impressive romanticism literature can be focused on by specific authors, works of literature, and how romanticism influenced their writing. P.B. Shelley was an open minded writer full of eagerness to envision new means of human expressions. So, what about the Arthurian legends? Arthurian legends effects in romantic literature. With the influence of the King Arthur came an extreme change in philosophies and lifestyles. Is that King Arthur came an extreme change in philosophies and lifestyles. Countless situations on how exactly the people of England alter their views on life where they become more cultivated and highly intellectual among themselves. The majority of the English society felt the need to escape the strenuous lifestyle that the Industrial Revolution brought upon. The Arthurian legends was an effect of the Romantic era and resulted in the abstract thinking and the beautiful arts such as music, paintings, poems, and stories. The birth of the Arthurian legends came from Celtic mythology and medieval romance, and the existence of the presence of magic confirmed the conception of artistic intellect. Then, how did Romanticism affect the Romantic Revolution? Okay, so this is also one of the important part in Romantic literature. The political, ideological, and economic climate of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was ideal for allowing the Romantic Revolution to take hold and flourish. It began primarily in England and France, but soon spread to much of Europe and to the United States. It will focus on romantics' relationship with the natural world, their distaste for the Industrial Revolution, and how the Romantic poets valued imagination and emotional connections. Okay. So these things, it shows that how it will be focused on the romantic's relationship with the natural world and their distaste for the individual revolution and how the romantic poets valued imagination and emotional connections. The romantics had a lasting impact of European and American society, political ideals, and the regard we hold for ideals and values such as nature and childhood. The Romantics' ideas ran counter to much of the thinking of the intellectual community and to the values of industry and government of the time. However, the Romantics thought differently because that Romanticism was an artistic and intellectual movement originating in Europe in the late 18th century and characterized by heightened interest in nature, then emphasis on the individual's expression of emotion and imagination, especially its departure from the attitudes and forms of classism and rebellion against established social rules and conventions. The Romantics felt all the opinions of the Enlightenment were fraught with the dangerous errors and oversimplification. Romanticism may then be considered as a critique of the inadequacies of what it held to be enlightened thought. Nature was one of the similarities of both eras. They had marked the world in believing that nature is something and that will keep our calm and feel safe like all the writers at the time believed in. Okay, so this is the initial part of that romanticism and where it's originated, when it's happened, what are the things made, what are the movements had done among that period.